All right. Well, I am very happy to be here with everyone. Very excited about today's talk with Shabana Mir from the American Islamic College, whom I will introduce in a couple of minutes. My name is Bassam Haddad. I am an associate professor at the Shar School of Policy and Government and director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University. I'm also one of the core faculty members of our of the Ali Volal Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies. Thank you all for joining us once more for the fifth session of our center's webinar series on COVID-19 and Muslim religiosity with Dr. Shabana Mir. On the title of the talk is Everything Has Changed, But We Can't, Muslim Religious Responses to COVID-19. If you have missed our previous webinars, in this series, you can access them from the center's website or its Vimeo account. A few administrative details will be shared first, and then we will get into introducing the speaker. And perhaps we can also add a link to the previous sessions in case people would like to access them later. The center's research fellow and the Maidan's editor-in-chief, Ahmed Teglioglu, will be hosting and supporting the webinar, and he will be posting reminders and the links in the chat box. Please check that out. During the talk, we will be muting all attendees kindly. There will be a question and answer period after Dr. Mir finishes presenting. During the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and we will ask you to unmute yourself to ask the question. If you prefer to type your question into the chat, we can also read it during the Q&A. We will call on people or read questions in the order they appear in the chat. The chat is able to be viewed by all participants, by the way. I also want to let you know that the webinar, including the Q&A session, is being recorded so that it can be made available via the center's website and social media in about a week or so. So please take note that this is being recorded. It will be made public. We encourage you to visit, I'm saying take note, it's not a threat. It's just to make sure that people know that it's being recorded. That tone was not right, sorry. We encourage you to visit the website of the Ali Volal Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies to learn more about this series, but also its general projects, programs, and people that are affiliated with it, and to also take a look at Maidan, the online publication of the center. I would say the stellar publication of the center. Also, please note that the next session in the center's webinar series will be held on August 25 with Camila Mu'min Rashad from Westchester University of Pennsylvania and Muslim Wellness Foundation. The talk will be on holding on to the light of faith, Black Muslims coping with COVID-19, social unrest, and racial violence. Please visit the center's website for the details. Now, I would like to introduce our scholar for this afternoon. Dr. Shabana Mir is Associate Professor of Anthropology at American Islamic College, Chicago, international public speaker on Islam, gender, and education, and author of the award-winning book, Muslim American Women on Campus, Undergraduate Social Life and Identity, from University of North Carolina Press in 2014. Muslim American Women on Campus won the Outstanding Book Award of the National Association for Ethics Studies and the Critics' Choice Award from American Educational Studies Association. Dr. Mir has worked in the United States, the UK, and Pakistan, and has published numerous articles and chapters. She is also a long-standing blogger at kunjblog.wordpress.com, which we could actually also add to the chat to make it available. So there's going to be a host of links in the chat, so please take a look. Dr. Mir, we are very excited to have you with us, and we look forward to your discussion and presentation, and then we will move to the Q&A. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I hope everybody can hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. I had some issues with my Bluetooth just now. I'm very excited to be here in the George Mason Ali Volal Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies series on COVID-19 and Muslim religiosity. It has been a really excellent series. I have been excited to attend so many of these talks, and I'm excited to see that Dr. Kamila Rashad will be speaking next time, so I really recommend listening to that one. There have been a very good series of lectures, both with George Mason here and with a number of other community organizations have stepped up to address the issue of how Muslim communities, Muslim organizations, Muslim activists and organizers have stepped up to really address the challenges, the many challenges of COVID-19, and we're all dealing with them. And I so appreciate people being here at this time, because I know it is a rough time for many of us. In this talk today, I am going to try to address specific areas of my own expertise. I'm going to speak to interpretive religious responses in the era of this pandemic, with a focus on gender inclusivity, as reflected in particular moments here, primarily in the United States. I'm especially interested in how we often see in contemporary Muslim practice a polarization, a politicization of religious practice, where to seemingly shift in response to circumstances is often represented as selling out to modernity and or westernization. Footnote, of course, Muslims have always shifted in response to circumstances in accordance with Islamic textual prescriptions. Islam in text and spirit encompasses a huge diversity of practice, including such shifts. In fact, even to call them a shift or a change or a reform is a little bit inaccurate, because they're already part of Islamic reasoning and jurisprudence. Basically, they're already in the building. But as shorthand, let's call this an interpretive flexibility. So in many cases, interpretive flexibility has been opposed and challenged by some gatekeepers. So there is kind of a symbolic swagger, where to be seen as unchanging is seen as being more traditional, more conservative, more authentic, or more orthodox, better Muslims, basically, even though the reality is quite different, in my view. So the global pandemic of COVID-19 presents us with a critical case in this respect, where literally life and death matters ask Muslims to adjust to everyday non-crisis practice, again, in accordance with Islamic provisions for such crises. But we see that in some quarters, there is a good deal of dragging of feet to respond to this crisis, especially in the early stages. But in addition to that, there is another layer that relates to gender. And that is that there are frequently practices of gender exclusivity that have ended up becoming exacerbated in some quarters under COVID-19. So it's very hard to make general overview claims about US Muslim responses to COVID-19 in terms of flattening the curve. Like, how well has this community done? You know, these are kind of interesting questions to ask. And I would say to that, you know, a very vague answer: Muslim community responses in the US have been overall not the worst. And you've seen some very bad examples among some religious communities in responding to COVID-19. Muslim responses have not been among the worst, and often have been some of the best among religious communities. And that's neither here nor there, but it's a very complex community. So this same claim can be made also about many non-US locations. And for example, I'm going to now start sharing my PowerPoint and hope that all goes well there. So, we have skipped ahead a little bit. We'll go back. So there's the Hajj. And at the Hajj, we've all seen these very dramatic scenes. To many of us, they have been heartbreaking scenes of an empty haram or a very socially distanced tawaf. Hajj was scaled down dramatically. Instead of 2.5 million Hajis, we have had 10,000 Hajis. And normally, this is another aspect of the Hajj, is that normally where you hear how during Hajj, the Haram is one of the few masajid that experience no gender segregation. I would like to draw attention to this particular tawaf, which has regulated tawaf circles, male and female tawaf circles, so that gender segregation actually was enforceable. And the question may be asked then, if COVID-19 becomes a feature, more or less permanent of future life, how will this change the face of the Hajj as we know it in certain respects? World Eid prayers have also reflected some serious efforts at social distancing. You've had a number of sort of representations of such social distanced Eid prayers. So as you can see, even in many Muslim countries, there has been a strong effort at social distancing and quarantine observance. Now, during the early pandemic, you had a number of hiccups in the enforcing of social distancing and safe pandemic practices. And so you find around March 2020 that you have some kind of like outcries against this kind of lack of social distancing, packed masajid, and so on. So this is the 20th of March, and people are calling out for better pandemic practices. And so actually the Pakistani president asked Al-Azhar to deliver like a fatwa saying you really don't need to have congregational prayer at this time. It's okay. In fact, it's better not to do so. So the Al-Azhar responded with a fatwa that was then passed on. And there was a whole controversy over this in Pakistan. I'm not going to address that today. But by this time, again, this is March 20th, some mosques are empty. Friday prayers closed down. This is like unheard of, unprecedented practice. You can see here, this is Riyadh's a grand mosque, and the only person, there were only staff praying there, and the muezzin says the feeling is indescribable. The minarets are crying, and the mosques were once full of worshippers, and the muezzin is crying. And I mean, we have shared this feeling. It's been very difficult. It's not been something that we've enjoyed doing, shutting down these prayer spaces. So it's been very difficult. So, so you have at this time, people are starting to pray in their homes, and the Karbala shrine was closed. This person is praying alone. There's Morocco, Friday prayers all by themselves. And it's been very difficult. And you have found, we've seen that, this is an Al Jazeera quote, most major mosques worldwide closed their doors to Muslim worshippers for Jummah, but there were bouts of communal praying. I found the phrasing a little funny, bouts of communal praying, like it's a disease almost. And so you have, but you have the sadness like weighing over these very important dates of the Islamic calendar. So you have Ramadan, then you have Eid al-Fitr, then you have Eid al-Adha and the Hajj. These are really important dates of the Muslim calendar. So the Daily Sabah reported that the communal spirit of Ramadan was profoundly impacted by the pandemic. Tarawih prayer is something that the devout really rely upon, look forward to during the year. Iftars, cafes for people who don't necessarily want to go for Tarawih, but who want to hang out, socialize, etc. All of these things were shut down. And so you found that people, quote, Muslims now find themselves cut off from much of what makes the month special as authorities fight the pandemic. So there were sacrifices, there were these spiritual, emotional losses throughout the Muslim world. Muslims worldwide have made huge sacrifices on these most sacred days of the Islamic calendar. So there is a grieving worldwide in the community. I want to really mention that because that's really important to recognize, that there is a deep emotional, psychological grieving that's going on in Muslim communities. And the sacrifices that have been made should not be belittled. Muslims worldwide are also reeling and suffering losses to livelihood, and the poorest among us are suffering the most. So just wanted to recognize all those things about how Muslims have also responded to the need for quarantining and social distancing. This is a United States, Michigan. And now, the thing that we have all noticed, I remember traveling abroad in February and thinking, well, I'm not really hearing anything from the authorities. So the authorities have been slow, and Americans have been slow to respond to the reality of the coronavirus pandemic being here, not just abroad. So the alarm was raised pretty late. I think that's fair to say. And there was a reluctance to take serious action, and this reluctance and this delay has been reflected in Muslim communities as well. So this sets the stage for some specific issues related to congregational prayer in the Muslim American community. When you have congregational prayer, you have people coming together, you have people, embracing, you have people hugging, handshaking, etc. All of these things are sunnah practices. They're recommended practices for fellowship and community. You have people praying together in packed spaces. It's highly recommended to pray shoulder to shoulder, right? So you're supposed to be near your community. So we have Muslim communities responding to the pandemic, and it seems dragging of feet was happening among a lot of Muslim leadership, because there appears to be a fear to change things. Right? And that relates to my title. So in our religious communities leadership, we have fairly top-down forms of leadership in many organizations, and it's tied to the views and opinions of donors, the loudest critics, and then the rank and file members. So there is a resistance to change. There is a consciousness of how things look, and this relates also to the issue of politicization of religiosity, in how certain forms of religiosity are seen as a form of selling out. And I talk about in my book also, I talk about a projection of an official Muslimness. So if you are interested, you can read that. It's called Muslim American Women on Campus. So in late March, Muslim organizations issued some statements related to COVID-19, and a joint Muslim task force on COVID-19 was formed. 36 organizations, you'll recognize the big names among them, and they are formed, and they address the issue of COVID-19. So in their statement, they said, listen, and I know there's a lot here, so I know this video is going to be available later, but I just want to address a couple of things here. If you look at the highlighted texts, the statement recognizes that there is scholarly disagreement. We know there's ikhtilaf, you guys, so talk to your people. We know there's ikhtilaf, but there's a few things you want to take note of, and that is you might want to just stop meeting your supplementary programs, your social programs, your educational programs, but we really would like you to suspend public congregational prayers. This is like unheard of in most of our lifetimes to do this. So they recognize that there is space for this in the jurisprudence, that you can have a small congregation, etc. But ultimately, we really recommend that public Jummah prayers are entirely suspended. So this is kind of a huge statement, right? But one of the organizations here, so you see I've highlighted where the kind of the flexibility is highlighted in jurisprudence. So there is an openness to that flexibility, which is within the jurisprudence. It's not introduced from the outside. Then one of these organizations, the Fiqh Council of North America, which has been a stalwart in the field, has offered a lot of service to the community. They issued a separate statement, and they exhorted Muslim American communities to modify their normal religious practices as a moral duty, right? So they say one's personal desire to do your obligatory prayers at the masjid comes second to ensuring the common health of the larger community. So as you can see, that your personal desire to pray at the masjid while a pandemic rages is represented almost as a personal selfish desire, like a hawa. So this is good, right? This is interesting. Now they need textual evidence for this very big statement, for this push to the community to do something that's they've never done before, right? So they need textual evidence. So they quote Umar radiallahu anhu, who refused to enter Syria when an epidemic was raging, and Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah radiallahu anhu says, well, we should really stick to the command of Allah and not change our plans or exercise precaution. Don't you trust God, and so on. And Umar replies, we escape from the command of Allah to the command of Allah. right? So epidemic precautions are not an irreligious response to the circumstances. They are actually a religious and moral and Islamic response. So it's not bad to take precautions or to practice quarantine. It's all good. So then the statement needs more strength, right? So they go on to quote prophetic hadith that urge Muslims to avoid epidemics like as if you are fleeing a lion, right? So when you leave the company of a large carnivorous predator, you don't tiptoe away from them slowly and say, well, you know, how far should I go? How far should you make haste, right? So in theory, all congregational prayers can be temporarily shut down to avoid virus transmission, given what we know about virus transmission and the pandemic. But then the statement took a step back and avoids the logical conclusion, right? It goes on to say, individuals can miss the Jummah prayer due to far lesser reasons like travel, etc. So fear of personal safety, viral transmission, etc., are sufficient to take the individual concession of turning Jummah into Dhuhr prayer, right? So the healthy Muslims, again, goes back to healthy Muslims can populate the masjid in reduced numbers and for limited periods of time. So there you find, again, this idea that it's not that bad, we can still keep doing this, right? The statement is the Shari excuse not to attend congregational prayer is really more of a focus on individual udhr, like an excuse not to attend. And the object is protecting yourself, right, from the disease. But if the object was avoiding societal spread, congregational prayer would actually be shut down right away, right? So it's not based on a very scientific understanding of viral transmission. It's more of an individual action. Why? Right? If the hadith had exhorted Muslims to, you know, stay in the mosque, pray congregationally, risk your lives, pandemic be damned, you know, one would have a textual problem. But we don't have the textual problem. The hadith actually allows for this. But in these religiously politicized times, these hadith sanctified exhortations for quarantine and social distancing are really not even treated like hadith by some people. They're treated like an attack upon pious Islamic practice, right? So hadith exhorting precautions are put aside in favor of adherence to a normal orthodox practice despite the prevalence of abnormal circumstances. So pandemic religious practice brings to the fore those pre-existing political issues in modernity that Islam faces. So the statement doesn't actually call ultimately for shutting down the mosque. It says healthy Muslims should populate the mosque in reduced numbers, etc. Then how are we going to achieve those reduced numbers? So here, who goes first? This is the issue that I'm going to go to. So here, the Fiqh Council of North America says elderly adults, women, children, and individuals with symptoms of disease shall stop coming to the mosques for daily as well as Friday prayers. Instead of Jummah, they shall do Zuhr prayer at home. This is a very interesting sort of motley array of demographics. Elderly adults, yes. Sick people, sure. Children, yes. But women? It's very like a strange kind of combination. Are women inherently old? Are women inherently childlike or sick? And so on. So this, but this is also not strange to many Muslims who are attending this, because the capital T traditional approach to mosque congregations is already pretty male-centric. You and I have heard the recommendations that women should pray at home, you should pray at home, you should pray in your secret chamber. And I want to highlight Professor Asma Saeed. Her work shows how the ijma, or the consensus in fiqh regarding women's prayer at home, actually contradicts the majority of the hadith, where there was an emergency ruling that was framed by a notion of social fitna, and it became a permanent ruling. So after I first spoke on this topic at another event held by Stanford University's Abbasi program, I heard from my colleague, Professor Marcia Hermanson at Loyola, who directed my attention to the Fiqh Council of North America statement, and it's been updated. So I checked and I discovered they have indeed updated it, but the date is the same. There's no comment that says we've updated it recently or anything like that. So the statement says there's the original one and there's the updated one, right? So the original one says what I just read to you earlier: elderly adults, women, children, and individuals with symptoms of diseases. And the updated version says elderly adults, mothers with small children, children, and individuals with symptoms of disease shall stop coming to mosques for daily as well as Friday prayers. So it's very interesting, right? You have this updating, this editing, revising of a statement, but no comment of, well, we screwed up earlier, but we're going to fix this now. There's nothing like that. There's just a quick fixing. And I remember I spoke on this topic in I can't remember the date, it might have been May. And then after that, this was changed. So the only reason I have the text is because I screenshotted it at that time for my earlier talk. So, I'm glad there is a change, but it still doesn't really make sense. Mothers with small children, what about fathers with small children? It's like, you're going to change them properly and then make a statement and say we really shouldn't be excluding women. There's really no medical reason to exclude women, and then to use the pandemic as a very like not even an excuse for excluding women just doesn't make any sense. So then you go on to another part of the statement where it says in cities where public gatherings are allowed, Friday crowds should be curtailed, controlled. All these are good things, right? All of these are good practices. I'm just saying there is so many good things happening in this, but why this like strange little thing is introduced that relates to women? So it says combining Zuhr with Asr and Maghrib with Isha is permissible to limit crowds. And this is like incredible flexibility. This is a, mostly Sunni organization, and they've got this like non-travel Jama and Qasr of prayer and so on. So awesome, right? But you have this awesome flexibility. And then on the other hand, you have this strange medieval, well, let's just cut the women from the congregation. Like it doesn't make any sense. So there's this like a strange back and forth. So I want to go on to then this Ramadan, right? The issue of Ramadan. Ramadan was a difficult time for the Muslim community. It was difficult because we look forward to Ramadan. We look forward to the experience, the spiritual experience and the community experience of Ramadan. And there was a lot of poignant emotional expression on social media and other places about how Muslims felt deprived due to the shutdown of taraweehs and daily prayers and so on, and especially men, right? So the irony for many women was clear. This is an experience we have on a regular basis of being excluded from the congregational prayer or from being accorded inferior spaces. And you can see how even in the Fiqh Council statement, women are the first on the miner's canary to disappear first. So, well, this is a pandemic, you don't have access to it, but we don't have access to it on a regular basis. I have the Chicago Tribune. Oh, this is a quote from Hind Makki, who does so much excellent work on this subject. I want to recommend you to check out her blog, the side entrance, tumblr.com. And she talks about how, men are talking about how we feel so bad about the Ramadan being so different, and women are like, welcome to our lives, right? And this is was an article in the Chicago Tribune. I was interviewed for it and a few other people also, where I talk about how we sometimes go to a mosque, and my husband goes to the men's musalla and he says, oh, that's a really wonderful mosque. I love this mosque. I want to go here all the time. And I'm like, I'm in the basement. There's one other woman there and there's a mob next to me, right? So this experience is a differential experience. There's an unequal experience here. So these religious adaptations, there are some that are new to the Muslim community under COVID-19. And, some of us are used to hearing what I mentioned earlier, close the gap, right? Shoulder to shoulder, foot to foot during prayer. And now we have fairly widespread good adherence to the 6-foot gap between worshippers. But as my friend Aisha Mattu reminds Muslim men, Muslim women are used to being actually invisible and being told to pray at home. And now under COVID-19, there is a leveling effect for this recommendation. All of us should really stay at home. So before Ramadan, there was another interesting debate that brought these issues to the forefront, and that related to whether Muslims can do virtual tarawih or not, right? So tarawih is not a fard prayer, it's a sunnah prayer. It can be, you know, offered. And now if we're not allowed to pray in person, we're not supposed to pray in person, it would contribute to spread, then why don't we do a virtual tarawih? But in the capital T traditional circles, this was opposed. There was a fear that virtual prayer would replace prayer in mosques based essentially on the slippery slope argument. So in other words, if we make an exception for the pandemic, it could become a permanent option. Very popular imams talked about this. But when you say this could become a slippery slope, to me, this appears to say, according to certain community gatekeepers, that we today, here and now, in the contemporary time, should not become creators of new precedent. That our precedents should be entirely located in the past and in the body of scholarship that is our Islamic heritage. Today, the present is not the legitimate source of precedent. And this makes the present time something dirty, right? Something dirty, something polluted that should be populated by, I don't know, ghosts of the past or texts of the past. And today we don't have the ability to do the ijtihad that creates new worlds as we go along. And some people expressed opinions opposing the virtual tarawih, because as they said, screens and prayer don't mix, and that people should be able to see the imam. And these same people, as other people on social media pointed out, these same people have not been vocal when women have been relegated to basements and separate rooms without visual access to the imam and the congregation, and or with CCTV alone. So going back to the issue of quarantine observance, personally, I would say that most mosques in the United States have actually been closed or been very careful during Ramadan. This is just a very quick, dirty, small study I did on social media. So as you can see, the majority of people who responded said that their mosques were actually closed, and some were socially distanced. But some were not. Right, some are still opening. And now that Trump's administration is really pushing the country to open up, we are seeing the same push reflected in our community to open up. And mosque communities want to open up and let precaution go. I was just speaking to my mother in Pakistan, and she was saying that it's really like after Eid, people have really started to let precaution go. And I'm just very upset about this and very nervous for my community. So as this happens, as communities start to open up, we yet again start to hear the same gender restrictive language that we encountered earlier. And this was brought to my attention by Dr. Shanaz Haqqani at Mercer University. You can see this Facebook announcement from a mosque that says that houses of worship may operate at 25% of their occupancy. And so then they say, we can accommodate 20 men and 5 women. Like the math, what is this math? Why? Literally makes no sense, right? It's just like, why do you jump to this math right away? If you can operate at 25% of occupancy, first come, first serve. How about that? Or how about like half musallas or something? Just accommodate people. Don't say these things, they're terrible. These things are terrible things, don't do them. Right? So again, women, like I mentioned, they are the miner's canary. They disappear first. So how do we achieve pandemic precaution? You cut back on women's attendance. Like, come on. I do want to point out a couple of instances of gender inclusivity. I have, for example, heard from Dr. Laili Fitri from Indonesia, and she talked about how her governor, who is a Muslimah in Indonesia, led the Khatm al-Quran and the Istighasa prayer in response to COVID, and she sat, publicly among them. And so these are good examples, right? And another example I want to quote is actually in Canada, so I seem to be going abroad for all these examples, and she's leading the takbirat and the zikr at an Eid al-Adha prayer event. And she mentions in the news story about how people naturally prayed in their own bubble at an intimate event. And what you find is that intimate, smaller scale events become a place of egalitarian and inclusive worship. And you contrast this with the Eid al-Adha prayers at these various mosques. So I've received some flyers from my friend Hind Makki, who is a powerhouse, and I shout out to her. She is a pillar of our community, and here, this is one example from a New York mosque, and I made the little piece bigger where they're talking about all these things. We have to do the social distancing, blah, 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 blah. And then they say, number 5, sisters and children under 15 need to pray at home till further notice, right? So it's almost like the pandemic, excuse me, I'm gonna get some water. I think it's my emotion as well as talking, right? So it's almost like the pandemic gives an excuse for this exclusionary practice to come up, even though the exclusionary practice is kind of a pre-existing condition for many of these communities, but it gives them an additional layer of justification. And you have another here, the Islamic Center of Orlando, physical distancing, blah, 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 all these things. Due to constraint, the salah will be for men only. Again, you don't need to do it like this. You literally don't need to do it like this. You can do, there are so many other ways. We are a creative people. We can come up with different ways of doing things. You don't have to do it like this. This one as well, Masjid al-Nur in Vegas. So the Sin City Mosque won't allow women or kids under 12. So a boy of 13 has access and a woman doesn't have access. And you have this, this New York mosque has 9 Eid prayers and not a one for women. There's 9 Eid prayers and they can't include women, but they can include boys over 10. Right? You're not going to exclude by age, for example, right? Can't you exclude by age, maybe? Or just say we're going to half like spaces, whoever shows up first? No, you're just going to say, well, sorry, we ran out of space for women because we're going to do social distancing, right? This California mosque, the Islamic Center of Northridge, forbids under 14s and women. If you can see this kind of like the same language that occurred in the Fiqh Council statement of women and children, right? So you have boys that are, under 14, boys under 11, boys under whatever, and women. So they're all crowded under this one category that is opposed to adult males. Right? The funny thing is, in this particular flyer, it says it's recommended that seniors over the age of 65 should pray. Seniors are literally more at risk of COVID, but you're not gonna like exclude them. You're just gonna recommend. But for women, you're gonna use the language of anyone under the age of 14 and women are not allowed. Like the language is not the language of recommendation. The language is the language of don't be here, right? This is really hard for Muslim women. It's very difficult. So women's access to religious spaces is always just waiting to end, whether it's for juristic arguments or pandemics, right? So the pandemic sheds light on this kind of interpretive work, this responsive work that's happening in Muslim American organizations, as well as the erasure of women. Now, there are positive things that are happening, but they're largely happening in organizations that are not guarded by gatekeepers, or they are not kept in spotlights for the representation of some kind of authentic or official Muslimness, right? So you find that in these spaces where there are restricted numbers of attendees, women get cut from the program before the pandemic, even if we run out of space before the pandemic. So you have Eid prayer, oh, too many men arrived, women don't have space anymore, sorry, go away, right? So the planning of women's spaces architecturally too is often a secondary matter. Just go and check out most of the mosques in this country. So in these difficult, stressful, very anxious times, Muslim women are also deeply and profoundly struggling with the same existential angst and the need for spiritual and emotional sustenance and community. So to see this sort of targeted exclusion extremely difficult and extremely alienating. I also want to say, because I'm a little afraid right now, I also want to say that women who highlight these exclusions are also the ones who are then marked as outsiders and excluded further, right? When our very critique is due to our need for these community spaces. If we didn't need these community spaces, we wouldn't be talking about it. So the pandemic sheds light on this interpretive work and the erasure of women. So if a pandemic can exacerbate the exclusion of women, might other events, such as economic instability, political upheaval, a, God forbid, continued Republican government, make our community spaces even worse for the inclusion of women? What other excuses will come up to make things even worse? And if this continues, if this trend continues and doesn't stop and doesn't improve, then what options remain for Muslims who don't buy into this sort of interpretive swagger? The forced, synthetic, symbolically traditionalist practice, this kind of exclusionary practice. We already have a huge unmasked population. What forms of community organization will those populations take? And they're already happening even as we speak. So what forms of polarization will polarization in the community take? I'm going to end here. And I'd really like to hear how the pandemic has affected inclusion and exclusion in the experience of some of my attendees. I see a number of friends here as well. So I'm gonna conclude here with thanks for your patience and with hopes for better times.
Thank you, Dr. Shabana, for a remarkable presentation that puts a lot of things in perspective. And I really personally appreciate what you have shared and the visuals, as well as the information on top of the analysis. We would like to see if people would like to ask the question first directly to Dr. Mir. So if there is a way for people to let us know through raising their hand, and I think there is a manner through which you can do this. So please let us know, and feel free to unmute yourself and share if there is no way for you to let us know through the app. Anybody would like to actually ask the question directly to Dr. Mir? I'll ask this first. And okay, Simi Ghazi, I will start with you. I saw you first. There might be others, but I saw your hand up. So if you, I can also help unmute you, and you could go ahead and ask the question. If you don't mind, Dr. Mir, shall we take a couple of questions and then we'll answer? So I'll ask Simi to unmute herself and ask the question, and then I will see if others would like to ask. If not, we have a couple of questions written down in the feed, and I'll ask them of you. Simi, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. That was brilliant. I'm going to come back and watch it again. And so, Shabana, I just wanted, the whole time you were saying this, I was, you know, the traditionalist in me, still, the traditional Sunni, super Sunni girl in me, who's also in you, was saying, but there's more thawab for men to pray in the masjid, and there's more thawab for women to pray at home, or at least equal thawab if we pray at home, and therefore the men who get the more thawab should have the. So what I'm wanting to know is, of course, this is a hadith. Was this dalil ever explicitly brought up in any of the places, or are people sort of not comfortable to bring up that dalil because it's not egalitarian enough, but they will act on it? Because that's what's underlying this exclusion every time. And that's why we should feel that we can swallow it, because we actually have this privilege of being able to pray in home and get the same barakah or more barakah. So that's my question for you.
Thank you, Simi.
Anissa Musa said something about the South African context in the chat, that actually in South Africa, this dalil was explicitly being cited. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi.
Simi. And before we move to the written questions, is there anybody that would like to ask the question? You can just indicate through raising your hand, or you can actually come on video and ask the question directly. Anyone interested? Since it's okay, so we have Noma Nabi, who has their hand raised. Noma, can you please feel free to ask the question directly?
Yes. So I put it in the chat, but I think I'll combine it together.
It would be best. Yes, please.
Yeah. So the question I had was for the mosques that did limit based on first come, first serve, including women, was that based on structural limitations? Like, did they use that as an excuse? And also the mosques that did not include women, and for the mosques that did first come, first serve, and they had separate spaces, did this kind of force some of them to do side-by-side praying in a main prayer hall? So basically my question is, has architecture and the moment changed certain practices that are not necessarily religious, but just how the mosque operates now?
Thank you. Before we ask Dr. Mir to answer, I do not see other questions that are unequivocal questions as opposed to comments on the feed. If you do have a question that you put on the feed, for some reason it is not coming through as a question, but as a comment. So I will wait until you share on the feed that it's a question, and perhaps you can add it now at the end, so we can make sure that we ask it of Dr. Mir. In the meantime, let me ask one more time if somebody would like to ask a question directly, because it actually is more animated, and I think it would be better if you can ask it directly, and you don't even have to be on the video. You could just do it using your audio feature. So I'll wait for like a couple of seconds, and then we will ask Dr. Mir to address these two questions. Okay, so we have waited, and Dr. Mir, it's all you.
Okay, great. Thank you for those excellent questions. I see I've been missing out on the party in the chat window, so I'm going to go to that soon. But I see that this discussion was happening there too regarding the first come, first serve. And I actually was not familiar with any mosques that had done a first come, first serve. For the most part, they tend to do this kind of more exclusionary, well, the vast majority of space will be accorded to men, and whatever's left is women, or the balconies and the other spaces are the women's spaces. So I was actually not familiar with that. So Hind, I see, has responded to that there was a mosque outside of Chicago, the Mecca Center, that many of us are familiar with, and they did have a first come, first serve registration process, and it is a shared hall. So it's not in a separate room or a separate balcony, et cetera. It's a shared hall, but they've had a COVID outbreak, so they've had to shut it down. So thank you, Hind, for contributing that. But other than that, I don't actually know of any that do a first come, first serve, whether you're a man or a woman. Kind of, they tend to have accorded, gendered, separate spaces for men and women. I've come across a few mosques that have shared musallas that allow for this kind of sharing, but you tend to know where the space for women ends, right? You tend to know that you can't go beyond that, even if there are more of you, and then you just like make do, right? I remember going into a mosque here in Chicago, and it's in the city, so it was very strange to me that there was 0 women there. There was no space for women, literally no space. I was in the hallway behind a huge room filled with men. And so for the vast majority of spaces, there are this sort of egalitarian, whoever shows up first can get space, is not typically a thing. Simi asked the question regarding the better to pray at home hadith. And I actually want to share a screen here because I have right now something I really use, and I'm really looking forward to using it in my classes too, because I always do. And this is Asma Said's very short article, and I really recommend you read it. It's a very short but very enlightening article regarding this, the sort of the hadith warfare on this issue. So it addresses the early Sunni discourse, and it talks about how there are different groups of hadith, right? That some of them, and she says that the vast majority of them actually indicate that the women were present in the mosque in the time of the Prophet. It gave permission to them, and so on and so forth. These outnumber, she says, these hadith outnumber those in the final category where women are encouraged to pray at home. Moreover, reports in the last category don't even occur and so they often have like problematic isnad, right? Despite this, people have made the interpretive choice to go with these problematic and fewer hadith, right? And so if you ask most Muslims, they'll say, well, we know that women are supposed to pray at home. So you have a very interesting kind of overcrowding of this very minority and problematic opinion. How does this happen? It happens because people want it to. That there is an exclusionary impulse there, and people go with it despite the lack and the weakness of the evidence. So thank you, Simi, for giving me the opportunity to say that. Thank you for that. And I really enjoyed seeing you at the Eid celebrations in Vancouver.
Thank you, Simi, and thank you, Dr. Mir. We have one more question from Aisha Hidayatullah, and the question is, have Saudi religious authorities made explicit statements regarding gender segregation at this year's Hajj?
I haven't seen any explicit statements regarding gender segregation, but if you look at the PowerPoint right in the beginning, or actually these images are everywhere too, you see those marked lines, right? So you have these marked lines that are very useful for social distancing, right? For pandemic precaution, but now they are male and female lines, right? So you have the male tawaf and the female tawaf. It seems to me from looking at the images that the larger circles are for men, right? Because they should, do the longer tawaf. And the inner circles are seem to be mostly for women, but they are separated, right? Where in the vast majority of Hajj activities, there is no gender segregation. Like anybody who goes for Hajj says, well, there's no gender segregation there, right? And like families are praying together, men, women, husbands, etc. Everybody's just like praying together. You're not separating. You're saying, oh, go my female child and go pray by yourself while I pray with the men. It's not, that's not a safe activity, right? So, so at the Hajj, you don't have the separation, but when you have these smaller numbers, right? And this control of who's coming, it seems to me also from the images that children are not coming to these Hajjs. So people are making, the Saudi authorities have made particular choices in terms of selection so that this kind of adult male and female kind of separation can take place. If anybody has any other input on that, I'd love to hear it because.
Thank you, Shabana. We have a question from Anisa Musa. Anisa, would you like to actually pose the question directly?
Yes. Yes, if I may. Salam. Thank you for
Ahlan.
a wonderful discussion. So from Durban, South Africa, it's traditional Asian or Indian communities, and as I posted in the chat here, women, most mosques, the majority, don't allow women. They are banned. They don't even have any capacity or even any space for women to pray in it. So it's a huge issue here. But I wanted to talk to the intersection of factors. You mentioned the theology, and obviously there's social, cultural aspects as well. And I think ultimately, if we look at the theology, it's down to how they view women, how the ulama talk about women, and so if there isn't an egalitarian view, it's even if it's the complementary role view, that will affect how everything happens. And not having women in the main space, not having women in the mosque is really an erasure. And ultimately, here theologically, it's not even the gender balance theory where we have complementary roles and be equal. Very often it's about inequality, that men are superior, men and women stay at home and they're sexualized, and so it's that whole issue. But also the social cultural factors, the mentality of the community that refuses to engage with theology, so you get these progressive people, or even progressive men and women, but they won't engage with problematic theology, and they leave that to the ulama, and they will just obey or follow through. So it's a real struggle to impact change. And I think the solution for us has been alternate spaces, and I think the more creation of alternate spaces, but at the same time, still fighting for mainstream spaces, because alternate spaces are not the solution for the community, and how women are seen in society is really important. Yeah. So, and mosques is one of those spaces. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
for that, Anita. That's really great. I'm so happy to hear from South Africa. Sorry, Bassam, you were going to say something.
One issue. Noma Nabi was wondering if you had a chance to answer a question.
No, I didn't
missed
answer.
it, or
Yes.
and if you missed it, do you mind if she reposes it so you could answer both at the same time, or maybe you did answer and she missed it?
Actually, I think I did. This was about the first come, first serve question, right?
I am assuming so, but she.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I did answer it, but
so I just wanted to clarify. Besides the first come, first serve, I think I was wondering how much architecture, that is my main question, plays into some of this reasoning. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So if we can go to Anissa's question, please.
Yes. And then I want to go to architecture, because that's a really very important question. Thank you for the reminder, Noma. I didn't actually speak to architecture. You're right. Anissa, I'm so excited to hear from South Africa. It's such an amazing place where so much is happening. And I'm very it seems like wonderful things happen, but also really bad things. But this is like so descriptive of so many of our communities, right? Wonderful things are happening, new places are happening, new liberation theology is being developed, so not libertarian, but liberation theology is in development. But also there are these spaces that are digging in heels and ensuring that nothing will change. Like my title, we are absolutely never going to change. In fact, we are going to go backwards, right? So the issue of unequal spaces, you're absolutely right. There are unequal spaces, and that really relates to this problem that it's not just about the spaces. It goes to a fundamental understanding of women's role as not being in the public sphere, that women's role as being primarily domestic and sexualized. This is absolutely the root of the question. When you have mosques that restrict women's activities to basically like cooking food in the kitchen or taking care of the children, then you have this understanding. So that is where the root is. And you're also right in terms of the engagement with theology. Like I said, for example, in relation to this question of mosque spaces, right? That Asma Said's work, where you have a theology and there is a neglect of that theology, where you have sort of a vast majority of hadith saying one thing and you have a neglect of it because you want to do things, right? So in Islam, we have this thing of they want to follow their personal desire. So it's almost like that. There's a desire to exclude women, and we're going to do it no matter what, right? Because this is the way we are. I remember back in when I was a brand new immigrant in this country, and I first thought, oh, I'm in America now, I'm going to go join the MSA, and I go to the MSA executive committee meeting, and there's no other women. It's literally all men, and the meeting is being aired by microphone to the women's section, so they can't they can hear it, but they can't talk back to it. And this actually is reflected also in a lot of our Jummahs and other events as well. So so I said there, I said, what are we doing here? Why is it like this? And a brother said, this is the way we are. We're proud of this. This is the way we are. So there is this kind of impulse where a sort of an official Muslimness is identified as being different from the way these Westerners do things, right? Even if that contradicts your hadith, even if that contradicts the Quran, we're gonna be this way, right? And you're also absolutely right in terms of the very often we have progressive Muslims, and I'm including actually mostly liberals who don't engage with the theology. And I see very often this impulse in many Muslim countries and Muslim communities where the liberals will actually very often either just go along with that kind of conservative view, oh, well, that's the right way to do things, so I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to go along with it. Or a total rejection of religion altogether. Or they say, well, this is why we don't follow Islam. Well, this is why we hate the Muslims, right? So this is very often seen in elite circles in Muslim countries. So you have like a matching Islamophobia in many Muslim communities where the liberals will buy into this sort of theology, and then they will use it as a way to like basically strike the theology down. So this is like really sad. And on the other hand, you have hope in these alternate spaces, right? But as you said, these alternate spaces are not the solution for the vast majority of us, right? They're spaces for the people who can choose to go to these spaces, who can create these spaces, who can be plugged into these spaces. I know some of these spaces. I know some of these communities. There are very few of them, but I know a few of them, right? And I'm plugged into this discourse, but even I know very few of them. So imagine the vast majority of people. So yes, we absolutely have to address this question. So thank you for that, Anisa. I want to go to Noma's issue of architecture. This is a huge thing, and it brings, I think for many Muslims, that will bring back memories of like bad memories of architecture choices and building and construction and the way things are furnished, the way main musallas are constructed, main doors are constructed, basements are constructed. It will bring back all of those things. So I remember back in the day when we were trying to do some things at the Bloomington, Indiana Mosque, which has changed a lot since then, but at the time, I remember there was this Muslim woman who was one of the, what is it called? The Sisters Committee or some kind of auxiliary committee or something, right? And they said, we'll allow you to go with us to pick out carpets for the women's area. And they said, oh, which ones do you want? And she said, I want the same ones that you want for the men's musalla. And they said, okay. And they didn't. They literally picked like an inferior carpet for the women's musalla, which was in the basement, which got so freezing cold in the wintertime. And I would have, I remember my dear friend Suhaib Sultan, Imam Suhaib Sultan, he was an undergraduate at the time, and he'd come down and say, it's really cold here. And I said, is it cold upstairs? And he'd say, no, it's kind of toasty. And so these are these inferior spaces. These are choices that people make. They're not accidents. They're choices that people make. I remember going to this mosque, and it's not perfect, but I remember going to this mosque where there is a balcony and it is separate, but there's a staircase that goes from the balcony to the like side of the men's area. So if you want to communicate, you are not shut off entirely, right? You can go there. There is a sort of a line of communication open. You are not in a camp somewhere hidden away, right? So architecture choices are key. And I remember hearing about this from Hind on social media where she was saying, don't ask me to raise money for your mosque. If you're not going to make the right choices for your architecture, I'm not doing it. Right. And I think we all of us need to ask these important questions. If you're building a mosque, what are you doing in terms of the choices that you make? My first good experience at a mosque was at Masjid Muhammad in DC. And it's a Warathin community, it's a Black mosque. And I remember feeling so at home there because it's one room. You're part of a community, right? You're part of a whole community. You're not separated off from that community. On the other hand, I'm in favor of having, you know, a separation for any women who choose to have it. That's fine, but you can't enforce it on everybody. So architecture choices are really, really key.
Thank you very much, Shabana. So we have a question from, by the way, let me just also say that a lot of people are posting valuable links and resources, and I have actually read comments saying people should save this chat. So I'm just reiterating that there are wonderful resources in this chat if you'd like to save the links and then visit them.
I feel left out from being in this and not being able to read the chat.
Oh, you know, just click select all. And then,
that's right. Yeah.
And there are people, you know, adding or providing more information regarding certain topics that have come up. So please feel free to visit the chat section. There's a question from Adeyoke. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation, and they say that their question is related to the subject of your book, Dr. Shabana, on Muslim women on campus. Does this current situation reflect on the question of the book thesis? Also, considering the gatekeeping, which is often beyond physical spaces, but virtual spaces as well, especially when women are seen but not heard. So if you would like to address this question, but before that, let me ask, we'll take one more round of questions and ask them all at the same time. And Rahat Kurd has shared that they have a question. So please try to pose it now. Feel free. Let me see, feel free if you to actually share now. I'll also be looking at
Farouk has been
other raised hands. Farouk, yes. So Farouk, would you like to address your question directly to Shabana?
Yes, happy to. Salams. It's actually El Farouk.
El Farouk, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's the L is usually dropped by Muslim folk. But there's a reason why it's there. But that's not why I'm speaking. And I excuse me if some of this was covered. I've had childcare issues, i.e. we don't have childcare today. And it actually sort of ties in. When I was in earlier, I had posted about how male parents are devalued as parents, as caregivers. So as a male parent, I have been told, oh, it's so nice you're babysitting as opposed to raising a child. So I wanted to actually, I had a question and then sort of turned into a comment and then turned back into a different question. And again, I've been in and out, so forgive me if any of this was covered. And it was with respect to, I'm one of the co-founders and the imam of the El Tawhid Jummah Circle, the Unity Mosque. And we have been we've always had an online component to our community for the 11 years that we have been in existence. So we've had physical space for 11 years. And we've had first access by Skype, then by Facebook Live. And then since March of this year, we have been exclusively an online community. So we partnered with MPV for the Eid, and that included the khutbah as well as the namaz portion. But we have been doing full Jummah with namaz being led since March of 2020. Now we don't have a designated physical space. We're a mosque in a box, so we gather for our physical events in community centers. but there's only one entrance because there's only one room, and there is no form of any segregation when we physically meet. And that's been now 11 years, every Friday for 11 years, with anywhere between 20 and 80 people at every Jummah physically. And what we have noticed is that since we've gone on Zoom, we're even more international than we were. And people are joining us from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, from South America. So we've got an increasing South American congregation as part of our, and so, sorry, this is a long comment, but I guess my question is, why don't dismiss us? Include us in your work, because I disagree with your statement that we're not accessible. In fact, we are more accessible. Even a space like the Noor Center in Toronto, which may not be as radical in terms of its degendering of space as the Jummah Circle might be, still affords opportunity to women and is accessible. Their services for Eid were accessible online. Through their website. So in fact, a lot of us are actually making more efforts to be accessible. We're now talking about ensuring ASL and sign language and other forms of accessibility. And in terms of the Unity Mosque, our events are never in a space which is not physically accessible to folk. So those are like the pre-requirements. So even sort of like in dominant culture, and I don't call them traditional because I don't think segregation is tradition to Islam. I think it's traditional to some Muslim cultures. You don't have, if there's no elevators or it's not on the ground floor, it doesn't take place in that space. So I think those things are possible. And I think that in conversations like this, places like Inclusive Mosque Initiative, the Noor Center, the Unity Mosque, and other spaces and places, Masjid Rabia, which is in Chicago, and so on, do need to be centralized and not marginalized, because we are actually in many ways more accessible than dominant culture spaces to all kinds of people. So sorry for my rant. And there's somewhere in there, there's a question. I don't know where it is, but I welcome your comments.
Thank you, Al Farouk. And before we get to the question by Rahat, who just shared that she would like to ask it directly, we have one more hand up, and that is Farah Zeb. So Farah, would you like to pose your question, and then Rahat, and then I'm assuming we will actually end up waiting for Dr. Mir to answer, and then we will wrap it up right after. If you have a question to add, you may add it to this list, and I could pick it up as others are asking. Please, Farah, go ahead if you don't mind.
Okay. Thank you, Bassam. Dr. Mir, thank you very much for your talk. Just a quick, brief question. In the research that you've just spoken about, did you come across any categories in terms of when you were mentioning that elderly, women, and then children, and then women with children ought to pray at home? Did you come across a clear articulation of disabled people? Often our community excludes disabled people, and I'm wondering whether in your research they still remained predominantly invisible.
They're invisible. That's the answer. They are invisible. Yeah. And that's I'm going to just respond to that question because it's a quicker response. They're absolutely invisible. In fact, in relation to the virtual Tarawih question, where people said, oh, no, we shouldn't do this, then the question was raised. I raised the question of why shouldn't we do it? Because it's so much more accessible to people with disabilities. Why shouldn't we offer this when it is something that is so difficult for many people with disabilities? I am a two-time cancer survivor. Going for Tarawih in person in Ramadan is quite arduous for me. And I don't know, the rest of you at our age, it's kind of difficult to make it through the night and then wake up the next suhoor as well. So people with disabilities, you're absolutely right, are quite invisible in many of these spaces. It's very difficult, and Al Farouk has pointed out these spaces where these people with disabilities are centered, not just offered a SOP, not just offered a here's this for you and here's that for you, but are centered. right? And that's really important. And Masjid Rabia, I also, I'm very much a supporter and somewhat a participant when I can in Masjid Rabia as well. So there are these mosques that really do this work, and that do also try very hard to be sort of gender inclusive as well. And yeah, so, but we have a long way to go.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah. Should I go to?
Yes, we have one last question from Rahat, and I would like to ask her to pose it.
Please do.
As yes. I'm assuming it's a her. I apologize if I'm wrong.
Rahat is a her.
Rahat, would you like to pose it, or would you like me to read it?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I just needed to unmute. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shabana, I'm just reflecting on your presentation and some of your concluding remarks around, you know, this sort of liberal Muslim passivity, wanting to go along and get along. So my question is about the political will for change. What's your diagnosis of Muslim feminists, anyone who identifies as a Muslim feminist? What will it take to generate the political will to fight for equal spaces, to equal access to the mosque space?
Okay, that's a really tough one. Should I go ahead and respond to that? And then
Yes.
I actually don't want to forget that Adeoki also has a question. But
Yes.
but that question is right there, so I can respond to that after Rahat, if possible.
Okay, so what we will do is, since we already announced a couple of times, I'm assuming this will be the last set of questions. So if you could answer them, and if you can access the last one directly, that would be great.
Yeah.
And then we will wrap up. Before I move, there's a request for Dr. Shabana's email. I guess I will leave this up to Professor Tekilyoglu to respond to that. And I'm assuming that Dr. Shabana would have to give the okay. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
No problem. And that can be, I think, included with the link or where the video is posted. That's not a problem. My email, by the way, is listed also at my institutional website, which is ACGIS.edu, American Islamic College. If you look up faculty, I'm there, and my email is right there. It's Mir, M-I-R, at ACGIS.edu. Also want to give a shout out to my institution, American Islamic College. We offer some great courses, and I would love to see you there. We're all online this fall. So if you want to join, I want you in my classroom, you know, really rocking the boat. So that's what I love to see. By the way, I have a gender and Islam course this fall. So who knows, maybe it'll be overcrowded now. So, so I want to address Rahat's point. And Rahat is sort of is a warrior in this field. She has been for a long time. I also want to give a shout out. She's an amazing poet, and she has been active in this field for a long time. So she's talking about how the political will to change, right? This is a real struggle, and I watch Muslim feminists engage in this struggle for decades. And I watch a lot of really good change happening, but I also watch pendulums come right back to the same old questions over and over and over again. The same, you should be at home, the same, what about hijab, the same old questions that enhance invisibility and erasure keep coming up. I think a lot of Muslim feminists are doing a lot of work, and a lot of Muslim feminists are being heavily demonized, right? So that makes it very difficult for Muslim feminists to have an impact in the community. We can have an impact in scholarship a lot of the time. We can have an impact in the academy. We can get published. We can have you know, tenure, but we're, I think, in many ways out in the cold. And that's really difficult. I don't think people realize how difficult that is, to have community spaces not be receptive to these very fundamental questions of access and humanity. And I think that's really very difficult for Muslim feminists. We're very often, Muslim feminists are so focused on the struggle that we don't get to just sit down and say, we're so tired of this. It's really exhausting. And we are your community, we're not outsiders. We're doing this because we are your community. We're doing this precisely because we want to stay in this community. We want to raise children in this community. We want to be in this community. We want it to be home, right? If it's not home, you try to decorate your home, you clean your home gets dirty, you clean it, right? That's what you do, right? That's what you do with a home, because you want your heart is in it, right? So, but very often we are blamed and demonized for asking for this kind of change. Why are you rocking the boat? Why are you making fitna? Why are you making us look bad, right? I mean, we're not making you look bad. Literally, it's already really terrible, right? So when my daughter goes to the mosque and says, why are they always talking and we're always listening? I don't have an answer for her. When she goes there and says, why are we hidden up in this balcony and they are basically on the stage? Why? I don't have an answer for her. And I want to be able to provide those alternate spaces that some of you have been talking about. I want to be able to provide those spaces to demonstrate this. In some of the community spaces, there have been real efforts towards this sort of inclusion, right? But when I start saying things like, why do we have to have the women in the back and men in the front? You know, we live in the United States, for example. This being in the back thing is actually, it's kind of triggering in a lot of ways, like being in the back of the bus, that sort of, it has very strong connotations. Can't we have side by side sort of separate congregations for men and women? What is the problem with that? Can women say some things, before the prayer? So can we do some things? Amina Wadud, a blessed scholar of ours and leader, has done things and has taken so much for it. And this is a person who has done so much service to our community and has dealt constantly with so many awful things, right? So it's a real struggle, right, that we have. And where is the political will? I'm not sure. When I look at mosques and I look at these really fancy, beautiful mosques, and I think we are building for tomorrow, right? We're assuming that there will be a tomorrow for these mosques. And some of these mosques are actually former churches where people stopped coming. So you should really consider that. These mosques and their organizers should really consider that, history has an arc. That if your community is not welcoming and it's not inclusive, history has an arc. And this is what we are trying to sort of prevent. Do you want your children to attend these mosques? Do you want them to feel welcome and happy and at home in these mosques? So these are some things that should really be considered. I want to go to Adiyoki's question. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I hope I am. Feel free to correct me. So the question is about my book, which is called Muslim American Women on Campus, Undergraduate Social Life and Identity. And the book actually focuses on the experience of Islamophobia on college campuses and reflected through Muslim college students, particularly mostly women. Actually, no, it's entirely about women, but their experience of campus leisure and social culture, and how that assumes a certain type of college student, and how many Muslim students feel that they don't belong in that type. But Islamophobia is very closely related to these sorts of exclusionary practices within communities, where very often when you are stereotyped and demonized, you very often set up a front, right? An identity front. And you say, this is who we are, and we're not going to change because we're so hated, we're going to stay this way. And so I argue in my book that the sort of this idea of we are Muslims, we are unchanging, we do things this way, even if our real lives don't actually reflect that, is related to Islamophobia. Right? So these are interconnected. This is not to say that we should bear no responsibility for our exclusionary practices, absolutely not. But it is to sort of explain and analyze that a little more. And it is to comfort the people who are trying to exclude and trying to sort of be like, oh, we don't want to be polluted Muslims. We don't want to be contaminated, westernized Muslims. No, you're literally playing into Islamophobia when you do that. Because you are literally rejecting part of your theology in order to represent this false front, which is the front that is expected of you by Islamophobes, right? So don't buy into that, right? Care for your community, love your community, and actually learn something about your theology and what our theology does for human beings. The letter and the spirit of our religion is not about this kind of exclusion. It is not about this kind of inequality. It's not about injustice. God is just, right? So I hope I've addressed. I think that the other question that Adiyoki asked is considering the gatekeeping, which is often beyond physical spaces, but virtual spaces as well. Yeah, yeah. Virtual spaces are also spaces where women are seen and not heard. And I'm thinking also about the virtual spaces where huge battles are being fought at this time over issues of race and gender right now in some virtual spaces involving Muslims. And yeah, I've been unplugged from some of those because you have to survive in this particular time. You have to take time for yourself to breathe. You have to take time for yourself to breathe. And you have to find, and I also want to remind us of the thing that somebody said earlier about the alternate spaces. You have to find the alternate spaces that help you breathe. You can't always be in the fight. You can't always be in the fight all the time. You have to take a moment to find your spaces, to find your family, to find your nest where you can, your heart can beat in a rhythm, right? To me, like when, for example, I'm speaking here, before I come to this talk, I say, God, make this for you, right? Make this only for you, right? This is my way of trying to purify my intention. So this is not just an academic exercise for me. This is not just a political exercise for me. This is a spiritual and a religious exercise for me. And I hope it is accepted. Taqabbalallah, I ask for your prayers and your good wishes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabana. We have actually a note before we close, and it's up to you to address it. A note from Simi Ghazi that says the questions were layered up. Perhaps return to Al-Farouq's comment/question. If you feel there's a need to do that, please go ahead. If not, we can conclude this session and I'll say the last words, so to speak.
Oh, I'm not sure. Did I miss something? Al-Farouq?
Perhaps Mr. Al-Farouq can share if there's something unaddressed.
Actually, why don't you ask Simi that question since
Simi, what's up?
She raised it.
Al-Farouq is like somebody.
I'm a lawyer.
Somebody save me.
So,
yeah, there was a kind of a wily raising of the eyebrow there, but no, well, I think Al-Farouq said, okay, catching some Roblox in the background here, but well, Al-Farouq sort of, he spoke about Al-Tawheed and Noor Center and those communities, and then he said, I think there's a question in there somewhere, and so I was, and he just welcomed your comments on what he had. So I was interested in your reflections, and I see your pieces speaking more to like the physical spaces, but I think one thing I am interested in is it seems like even leading up to COVID, there have been alternative physical spaces, and maybe you could just talk about that a little bit, and how you think that these also figure like sort of in your research. And another thing I think is like how you see this piece as being part of maybe a larger project that you're working on. There's this kind of physical space aspect of it, and then now it's extending into the cyberspaces. So
yeah, cyberspace, but also
that's
sort
what
of
I
a
see
cultural.
emerging from what El Farouk said. So.
Yeah, cyberspace, but also sort of a cultural space where we're developing this different way of being, you know, having community. I think it is in development. And I think that these places like the Tawheed Circle, Unity Mosque, Masjid Rabia, the Noor Center, these are places where, and the Women's Mosque, for example, these are places where, you know, we can kind of demonstrate, right, what to do, and this is something that I've been thinking about very often. Like, do we focus on, you know, the mega mosques that aren't shifting, where the boards are, you know, set in fossilized, not moving, not going to change, too many people, too many donors, too many angry people, like, you know, or do we just go and make our own thing, right? And I think that there is a good argument for going and making your own things. I think that that is the way you demonstrate how it can be done, right? And I think that's a very useful exercise. Some people have done these things, right? They have created these Jumas at their home, like different small communities of people. I know Peter Mandeville has been doing some research on this, and he's been talking about how the trend is now towards people, and this is actually something that I've been thinking about writing about as well, in that the trend is a little bit towards sort of a pragmatic eclecticism, where people go to like their traditional Sufi circle for the zikr, and then they'll go to the Muslim feminists for the equality, and then they go to somewhere else for this, because you can't get everything you want everywhere. I am so torn in different directions by this. I can't get everything in one place. I literally go to, I have identified different people for my different needs, for my academic feminist needs, for my academic anthropology. So I have various like spiritual needs you have, and religious needs, you go to different places, right? And then once they start saying in the khutbah, brothers do this, then okay, I'm done, I'm out of here. So you go and you get what you want, but you also need a place, and you also need to build that third space, which is going to be the real place for the majority of our community. Because the majority, from my perspective, the majority of the community doesn't have its place. That these mega mosques and the exclusionary spaces are actually minority places in our community. They don't speak to most of us. So that's my feeling.
Thank you, Dr. Shabana. With this, I think we have come to the end. This was extremely illuminating. The discussion was actually also very enticing, and the resources and sources that were listed only added to the enlightenment that Dr. Shabana has shared with us. So thank you very much, everyone. We thank you primarily, Dr. Shabana, for Shabana Mir, I go with first names sometimes, for joining us and sharing your ideas and your research and your thoughts with us. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to remind you that next week we are holding another session on August 25th at 2 p.m. titled Holding On to the Light of Faith, Black Muslims Coping with COVID-19, Social Unrest and Racial Violence. Please join us then. There will be definitely further announcements that will share with you how you could register. And we are very happy you all joined, and hope you all have a wonderful week. And the most important thing is to stay safe and take care of yourselves, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Thank you, Ahmed, for running the session from behind the scenes.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Salam.